channel. Mad Mike here, and today we are going to continue our journey to Endgame with part 7, and we will be examining the film that brought all of our Avengers together for the first time, Marvel's The Avengers from 2012. Now, this film was this was a lot of people kind of we've taken kind of the MCU for granted in certain circumstances, but this was really that first team up movie, and everybody thought that this was going to go one of two ways before this film came out. Everybody thought it was either going to be a rousing success or it was going to be an absolute failure. And really, it knocked it out of the park. And I think you had a good director slash writer in Joss Whedon at the time. He knows comic books. He wrote, I believe it was for Astonishing X-Men. He had done a lot of television and a lot of films. Specifically like Buffy the Vampire Slayer and stuff like that. So he had good chops, or he has good chops, I should say. But the humor in this film balances out, I feel, very well. The scenes are very well done. The character interactions are really good. Um, and obviously, you have all the characters coming back from all of those solo films, with the exception of Edward Norton as the Hulk, who's been replaced at this point by Mark Ruffalo for the first time, and that was mainly for contract disputes and certain creative differences with Edward Norton. But Mark Ruffalo, I feel, does a really, really good job. I like the CGI on his face more when he becomes the Hulk. He looks the Hulk actually has some physical characteristics that make him sing. You can recognize that it's Mark Ruffalo, and it might also have to do with Mark Ruffalo's jaw being a lot wider than Edward Norton's. But moving past that, you have all of your characters returning. You have Chris Evans playing Captain America. You have Scarlett Johansson coming back from Iron Man 2 as Black Widow. You have Hawkeye coming back from his cameo appearance in Thor as Clint Barton, Hawkeye. You have Chris Hemsworth coming back as Thor, Robert Downey Jr. as Iron Man. Um, like I said, Mark Ruffalo as the Hulk, and Sam Jackson coming back as Nick Fury, as well as Greg Phil Coulson, who's played by Clark Gregg. So you brought all of these characters together. Now you're also introducing Kobe Smulders as Mariah Hill, who's essentially Nick Fury's right hand woman. But this movie knows what it is, and it knows how to do things well. Like I said before on a lot of the other movies, when you introduce a character in a film, especially if it's the main character, you should emphasize what that character is all about. And I did that in the solo movies. But now you're in a movie where we've seen all these characters already. You need to get right to the plot. And that's what this movie does very well, because that first scene where you see the Tesseract and they're experimenting with it, you have Dr. Selvig, who's experimenting with the Tesseract in a shield facility, trying to basically perfect a form of portal technology. And Clint Barton is also there with Nick Fury, so you have really Jeremy Renner's first full role, because he really doesn't get a lot of. He has, like, I think 2 or 3 lines in Thor. I don't think he has a lot. Um, And unfortunately, he does kind of get a bit of a Hawkeye takes kind of a back seat, unfortunately, in this film. But I'll get to that later. But you set up the conflict. Loki comes through the Tesseract portal. It gets activated from the opposite side. You don't necessarily know what's going on, but you know Loki because you saw him in Thor, so you know he's a bad guy. Has this new scepter thing that basically corrupts people. And that's another thing that's kind of set up later on, too, which is very interesting. And again, Tom Hiddleston plays a very good role as Loki. He's definitely changed a bit since the Thor film. He's gotten more nefarious, darker. He's kind of carried that character arc that he ended that film with over more so into Avengers now. Um, and it's evident that he is there to be your prime villain. He is there to be your top villain. Um, and then, of course, he steals the Tesseract. Nick Fury manages to survive, as well as Mariah Hill. Hawkeye is corrupted, which, again, that's what kind of leads to his character being in a back seat for a majority of the film. Although he does get his comeuppance at one point, which is pretty funny. But and then Loki gets away with the Tesseract. So now you have your plot in motion, and that's what that opening scene needed to do. It's a perfect opening scene to start this movie. Then you have obviously the opening credits roll through, and you go into meeting our various Avengers characters. And they do a good job reintroducing some of the core cast. Thor is left until a little later, but you reintroduce Iron Man and Captain America and Hulk and and Black Widow. So you have all the basically everybody except for Thor, I think, gets introduced in that next few scenes, and you kind of get to see where everybody's life is at. Um, and that's interesting because we kind of we understood like where certain people were at the end of certain movies. Tony Stark is has built Stark Tower, which would eventually become Avengers Tower, with Pepper, and he's in a relationship with Pepper Potts now, and they're acting like they're in a relationship. So I mean, it's um, so that's carried forward. Captain America is trying to adjust to being essentially a man at a time. And Black Widow goes to recruit the Hulk, who's doing, or Bruce Banner, who's doing humanitarian stuff. I believe it's Bangladesh. I can't remember exactly, but uh, so you kind of get everybody in one scene. And specifically, I will cite this: the scene with between Scarlett Johansson and Mark Ruffalo, where she's there to recruit him or to bring him in so that they can find the Tesseract because they needed to track the gamma radiation signature. In that scene, Mark Ruffalo cements himself as an amazing Bruce Banner because of the way that he plays that scene where he pretends to get angry to see what she'll do, and the it's kind of cold blooded. Well, not cold blooded, but it's kind of interesting in the scene when she points the gun at him. She has a gun hidden under the table. When he gets angry, she points it at him, and he says, "You don't want to use that because you don't want the other guy to make a mess." And it's so messed up because you know exactly what would happen if she shot him. And they he brings that up a little bit later, where he talks about his suicide attempt, and how the Hulk came out and would basically he can't kill himself because the Hulk will just come out and like regenerate, and he won't die. But it definitely establishes a bit, and it comes up a little bit later on. It's kind of a precursor to their relationship as it would go forward in Age of Ultron. Um, so we make it past those scenes, and they manage to track Loki to this art gallery. In I believe it's Germany, and it's kind of an interesting thing where I'm not gonna give too much away, but it's basically a MacGuffin. Loki's looking for a quote unquote MacGuffin, and he leaves this place afterwards because he needs the equipment to build the Tesseract portal for the end. So everything that happens in this movie is essentially Loki pragmatically going through the process in order to open the portal so that he can bring the army through. And at that party, at that scene, we get introduced to Captain America's his first really introduction in full uniform, where he fights Loki. Now, I did skip a little bit past some stuff. I skipped past the helicarrier stuff, but I mean, it's mostly aesthetic. The helicarrier stuff I find really, really good, though the visual of it, the helicarrier lifting off from the water is really, really good. I wasn't 100% sure if they'd go with that look for the Avengers movie or if they were going to do something else, but the fact that they actually did have the essentially almost a very, very tried and true helicarrier representation is very surprising to me, but very welcome because it is a cool visual. It is a really cool visual, and the fact that it can blend in with the sky and stuff is really nice. But back to what I was saying is you have this kind of scene. I feel like it's a little bit hammered in where there's the scene where Loki asks everybody to kneel in the courtyard. It's kind of like, all right, I get he's an egotist, but it's kind of like, okay, you're kind of just screwing around. And the old guy stands up and basically equates Loki to Hitler. And then of course in swings Captain America to start beating up Loki. So it's I feel like that's it. The scene itself feels a little awkward, just for that. But it's still a welcome scene. It's still a nice little touch, and I think it's a decent introduction to Captain America in the suit. Then, of course, Iron Man shows up at the end, and they capture Loki. And now we have the introduction to Thor. They have the little throwaway line where he says, "Oh, the All Father mustered a bunch of energy to send you here," and stuff like that to kind of explain away the Bifrost being gone at the end of Thor, which chronologically came immediately before this movie. And so now we have the Loki gets away, and they have the forest fight scene. Or actually, sorry, he doesn't get away. They have the forest fight scene between Iron Man, Captain America, and Thor, which is, it's enjoyable. It's nice to see kind of the powers interacting and stuff like that. But ultimately, they go back to the helicarrier. Now, this again is a really great scene because you introduce how the Avengers relate to each other. Captain America and Iron Man are sort of begrudging rivals. They're kind of working with each other just to get the job done. Um, Bruce Banner and Tony Stark are kind of science buddies. You find out that Black Widow is very close friends with Hawkeye and how they're worried about him, and because he's had his mind messed up. Um, and kind of how Chris Hemsworth is essentially Thor is essentially kind of played as the straight man, more or less. He's not really jokey. This is kind of before his jokey phase, which starts really in Thor Ragnarok and continues a little bit into Infinity War. But they're good establishing scenes. They're good establishing scenes with the dialogue and stuff in between characters. It's very snappy dialogue. Some of it is definitely Joss Whedon-ish. I mean, we've been exposed to it enough where we kind of get how his dialogue works. So it's kind of that snappy comedic dialogue, very quick back and forths. But it does work because it's not just the same lines or the same setups for every line and stuff like that. It's not written lazily, I guess is what I'd say. It's written very, very pertinently. It's written well. Um, but you move past that, Helicarrier gets attacked, and there's a scene actually immediately before that between Black Widow and Loki, where it kind of it shows how good Black Widow is at what she does, where she manipulates Loki, who is essentially the most manipulative person in the MCU. She manages to manipulate him to give away his hand that he's going to use his scepter to manipulate the Hulk and to get them to basically to manipulate Banner into bringing out the Hulk. Um, so that's a really good scene where he goes through like, oh, you have so much red in your ledger and all that, which is basically she's killed a lot of people. But moving past that, even though it's a really really good scene, we go into what is essentially the breaking up of the team right before the coming together. And before this, they're working together, but they're all kind of squabbling, and they're not doing everything as a team. They're kind of just going about it on their individual levels. And when they finally have the assault on the helicarrier, where Hawkeye leads the men that Loki corrupted into attacking the helicarrier and almost brings it down. You have Thor that gets jettisoned in this giant basically thing they built for the Hulk in case they had to contain him and like drop him out of the ship. Um, Thor's he lives, but Thor basically gets jettisoned out of the ship. Captain America and Iron Man basically save the ship, save the helicarrier from going down. Which are both good action scenes. Even though I think the Captain America one's a little nick. It's like, oh, it's one dude. Like, okay, I kind of get it, but you move forward through this, and they have the whole thing. Thor versus the Hulk is amazing. I will say that the Thor versus Hulk battle is really really good, and that was probably one of the most enjoyable fights in the film. Was that whole interaction with them on the flight deck of the helicarrier, where they're just beating the crap out of each other and blowing apart airplanes and walls and crap, and it's really really good. You move past that. Now that the Hulk is out, essentially the Hulk gets jettisoned from the he gets jettisoned from the helicarrier and lands somewhere on the ground. He has to make his way to New York because it's kind of a blink and you'll miss it type of thing. I don't know why they would. I don't know why they would kind of skim over it as much as they do, but it's a weird scene where like it's right before essentially the shit hits the fan, where they show that Bruce Banner has gotten the location of the Tesseract, and they don't really say anything. He just goes, "Oh my God," and then you see like this little thing on the screen that kind of says New York, and then the room blows up immediately after that. Before he has a chance to say anything, so Bruce Banner knows where the cube is, but not many other people do. Um, and then you have the aftermath of that, where the Hulk basically steals a moped and drives into New York to help the other Avengers, or to stop Loki from opening his portal. But that's really kind of the battle that separates them. And then at the end of it, you have what was the film death of Phil Coulson, which is at the hands of Loki, and he really it it's kind of weird because Nick Fury has a conversation with Mariah Hill right after this, where he's discussing Coulson's death, and they use it essentially as a catalyst to move forward. And you feel almost like Nick Fury kind of instigated Phil Coulson's death, or faked it in some way, because he says they needed the push, is the line that he used. Um, and it's very odd, and of course, Clark Gregg as Phil Coulson would come back in the Agents of Shield television show, which is set after the events of Avengers. But it still feels kind of weird. It's one of those things in the movie I kind of take off points for, because they leave it almost a weirdly ambiguous way, and it might be because Joss Whedon and I believe his brother Jed were both writing the pilot episode for Agents of Shield, so maybe that's why they put that in there. But other than that, I don't really think that scene needed to be as long as it was. I think it could have just been a conversation between Mariah Hill and Nick Fury about Coulson and his death, and how he like disobeyed orders and did something, or something along those lines, instead of leaving it almost ambiguous. But I understand why, but it feels a little odd watching the film now and seeing that line, rather than or rather than at the time. Rather than at the time, where okay, I know what came after it, but it feels a little weird, if you're not familiar with the Agents of Shield television show, and knowing about Clark Gregg being in that show and all that stuff, then it feels kind of awkward and clunky. But now we get into really where this film shines, and that is the final act, or the final conflict. Now, we've been building tension the entire time, and the tension has essentially risen to a fever pitch now that Loki has escaped the helicarrier and has made his way to New York with Eric Selvig. Uh, Oh, and to just reiterate, Black Widow and Hawkeye have a showdown, which is kind of interesting, where Hawkeye is able to get snapped out of his uh, hypnosis, essentially, where he gets his head cracked on a railing, and somehow that manages to release him from Loki's control. So I guess you just had to. I believe Natasha says at one point, "I just hit you really hard in the head." Um, so Hawkeye is back on the good guys again, but again, he spends a majority of the movie um, taking a back seat. He doesn't really get any character development, which is kind of sad considering this is his first like full feature film presence. They do make up for it in Age of Ultron, where he gets probably the most character development out of anybody in the film, but it's still kind of sad to see him in his first appearance kind of get pushed to the backside, because he is a cool character in this. Uh, and so we move forward from that, but now we go into, like I said before, now we go into the final act. And so all the Avengers decide they need to go to New York and stop Loki. They figured out where he was going to be, or I should say Iron Man figured out where he was going to be. He was going to go to his tower. So Iron Man goes there and meets Loki at his tower, and there's a really, really great monologue between Tony Stark and Loki, which I think they put a good amount of it in the trailers at the time, um, where he lists off all the Avengers, and he kind of sums them up almost in like a sentence. It's like a summary. Uh, of all the different ones. A living legend that lives up to the legend with Captain America, uh, two killer super spies and Hawkeye and Black Widow, a demigod in Thor, and of course Hulk. But the scene ends almost perfectly, where Iron Man is essentially just trying to stall Loki so he can get his armor, his new armored suit, ready to go. And so you move past that, and we move into the final act where Loki opens the portal and the Chitauri army comes through. And this is one of the best. It's almost, I think it's almost a 25 to 30 minute action sequence, and everybody has stuff that they're doing, and everybody's getting the crap beat out of them at various points, and it's such a great action scene, and it's so well directed. Especially there's a pan shot, there's a very long panning shot that starts, and it goes through each and every one of the Avengers. Where it goes, I think it starts with Iron Man, and then he helps Captain America, and then they fly up, and I forget exactly how certain parts of it, how it actually flows. But they go, and you see if you see Iron Man, he flies through Captain America, then you see Hawkeye, and he shoots an arrow, and that goes and hits something, and then you see Thor. At the end of it is Thor and Hulk taking out one of these big Chitauri like lizard things that's flying through the air. Um, and it's a very, very well done action scene. The stuff with Hulk is hilarious, where Captain America is giving directions to all the Avengers, like, all right, Hawkeye, get up to that building. Tony Stark, make sure the mitigate the damage. Black Widow and him are going to stay in the streets and fight the Chitauri that are coming onto the ground, and Thor bottleneck the portal, and Hulky just goes smash it, and it's a perfect line. It's said perfectly, and then you just see the Hulk smile and just go up and start wrecking aliens. It is so hilarious and so well done. Where it's literally like almost like the Hulk is like a kid in a candy store, and it's great. And of course, this also leads to probably the best scene in the entire movie, where the Hulk crashes into the top level of Avengers Tower, um, and hits Loki. And Loki starts giving this speech about how he's a dull moron, and he doesn't know what he's doing, and he's Loki's a god, and he's high and mighty. Then the Hulk just ragdolls him. That is, I remember watching that in theaters and laughing so much at that, because it's so funny. The visuals of it are so funny, where it's just mid sentence he just grabs him and starts throttling him all over the ground. It's an amazing scene. It's probably the funniest scene in the entire movie, but it's so perfect. Um, and then Hulk just walks away and just goes, "Puny God." It's a great action scene, and I can't say enough about the action in this movie, that it's done so well. But the other thing that Whedon did with this final fight is he had everybody in their element, and he had them all doing stuff that was really, really good. They all had their moments, and they all had the stuff they were doing. Um, but it was all in unison. They were all in command. They were working together, and that's really the best thing, is it showed them actually working as a team, and that's what you needed to do with that final fight. It can't just be them just decimating aliens the whole time. It had to be some kind of coordinated effort, where they actually stopped this thing, instead of just turning New York into a wasteland. Um, but you go further, and you see that the only way for the Black Widow essentially figures out how to close the portal, where Loki's scepter is the only thing that can actually close the portal, and get them, and make sure that the Chitauri stop. At the same time, Nick Fury has been having conversations with, I don't know if they're world leaders. They don't really. They're kind of like a council that runs Shield, and they launch a ship. They launch a plane with a nuke, and their idea was to nuke New York City. Now, I find this to be kind of a dumb idea. It's like, oh, New York is lost to this giant portal thing. It's like, okay, then, hypothetically, why wouldn't you just blow up Stark Tower? That's what the device is sitting on top of. It's far easier to level one building as opposed to nuke a city. It's kind of it's a very weird kind of thing. It was like, okay, why wouldn't you just have a strategic bomb and just blow up that one building? That's the only thing you need to destroy because that's what the device is sitting on top of. If you destroy that, the device falls down and the portal closes and you lose power, I would assume. But instead, they chose to nuke the entire city. And I know it's kind of a raise the stakes thing, and it does work out, but I felt it was kind of a stupid plot idea for the end of that movie. But this is when you have the biggest moment in the whole film, which is Iron Man essentially, again, as we've said in Iron Man 1 and 2, the idea of sacrifice, or at least the first one, the idea of sacrificing himself for the greater good, essentially. Where Tony Stark takes his Iron Man suit and redirects the nuclear missile up through the portal, sending himself through the portal as well, um, and sending the nuke up into the Chitauri fleet and destroying it. And they close the portal, and Iron Man sinks through at the last second, and he winds up getting saved by Hulk because he passes out when he goes through the portal because his suit's not built for space, um, and then he falls back through, and he gets helped out by Hulk, and of course we have. Then, after the final battle, we have the end where everybody kind of goes their separate ways. Tony Stark goes off, Captain America goes off, Thor goes back to Asgard with the Tesseract and Loki. Um, Bruce Banner and Iron Man go off together, and then Nick Fury kind of has this little monologue about, oh well, they'll be there if we need them again, and this kind of stuff. And then of course we'll go into Phase 2 of the MCU later on, but. There's a few things I would like to say about this film in regards to, um, I have to reiterate, I love the action in this movie. The action is perfectly done, but there are a few plot points that don't really work. The nuking the city part, that doesn't really work that well when you think about it for more than 5 seconds. If you're in the movie, you can kind of suspend disbelief, or if you're in watching the end of the movie, you can kind of suspend disbelief, but that doesn't work very well. Hawkeye doesn't get that many moments. He has a funny moment with Loki where he blows him up with an arrow, but um, for the most part, the plot does a good enough job to keep the movie going. And it is really good at points. And the dialogue is really good. I have to give it to the dialogue. And again, the plot is... I take a little bit off of the plot, but the dialogue does make up for it, and the interactions between the characters does make up for it, as well as the little fight scenes throughout, leading up to your end fight scene. But it really, really does a good job at kind of... Not just... It's... It's not the same as some films where they keep all the action for the end and everything else is the build up. There's a lot of action that's spread throughout the movie, and the reason they were able to do that was because of all the lead up films. And that's why it works, is because you have all these films leading up that explains these characters and the background and the various worlds they come from and why they're here and how they got there. And that's why they were able to do so much with this movie in terms of just, we can skip over all this other stuff because it's already been covered and just focus on the story we want to tell of these characters coming together. And Marvel did a really good job planning that out and then releasing this film. And that's why this film made $1.5 billion at the box office and set a weekend record at the time of a little over $200 million. Or domestic opening at the time, which is a little over $200 million. So, that, again, if you haven't seen Avengers, you probably should. It's a really good movie, and it's one of my favorite MCU films. It's definitely better than the second Avengers, I would say. But just to give it a rating, I am gonna have to give this movie 8.5 Hulk ragdolled Lokis.
And I will not be bullied by that. Puny God.
Out of 10. And so now that we're through Avengers, we can start going into Phase 2 of Marvel. And we will start off that with Iron Man 3, which came out in 2013. Directed by Shane Black, again starring Robert Downey Jr. as Tony Stark, Gwyneth Paltrow as Pepper Potts, Jon Favreau as Happy Hogan, even though he did not have directing duties, and introducing Guy Pearce as Killian. So we will get to that movie next time. As usual, thank you for listening. Leave a like on the video, leave a comment, hit the bell for notifications, subscribe, and remember, I live my life free of compromise. Do you?